I got it. Yeah. There we go.
Thank you. Thank you. There's always something, right? I was like, this event will be recorded, and then I forget to record. Okay, so onward. We're going to begin then with our two American guests. And they will begin. So just a quick word about the structure. They're going to begin in a few moments, and they will present for about 20 minutes, and then we'll follow with a 10-minute Q&A. And then after that, we will turn to our two Canadian guests in same structure. They will have a presentation, a slightly longer one, and then a Q&A. So we very much hope that you would enjoy. So the title of today's event is Spirituality, Cultural Diversity, and Social Work. And to talk to these subjects, we've invited Dr. Diana Franco and colleague Dr. Maribel Lopez. Dr. Diana Franco serves as a clinical assistant professor at La Loyola University in Chicago School of Social Work. Dr. Franco has been a clinical social worker for over 20 years. She graduated with a master's in social work from Columbia University in 2000 and with a DSW, Doctor of Social Work, from New York's University's Silver School of Social Work in 2018. Dr. Franco provided school-based social work services for 18 years with the New York City Department of Education, and believes that there is a correlation between academic success and social emotional well-being. Her area of research focuses on addressing the academic and social emotional needs of immigrant and undocumented youth. She believes that the various and complex needs of immigrant youth in the education system may be addressed through trauma-informed groups in their native language, while incorporating the students' cultural values and beliefs. Dr. Franco's work delves into the relationship between trauma and the migration process, the social justice system, and human rights. Her research has been published in the Child and Adolescent Social Work Journal, the Journal of Progressive Human Services, International Journal of Progressive Education and Social Work Education, and she has presented her work nationally and internationally. In addition to her contributions as a social worker or school social worker, Dr. Franco has provided psychotherapy in English and Spanish in various mental health clinics for children, adolescents, and adult service users. Dr. Franco is a trained volunteer clinician for Physicians for Human Rights, PHR, and that's neat, and the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center, where she conducts psychological assessments for migrants seeking asylum. Dr. Franco is committed to creating a safe and inclusive academic environment that challenges and stimulates students to create new knowledge. So welcome, Dr. Franco. Her colleague, Dr. Maribel Lopez, is a faculty member also at La Loyola University Chicago for the School of Social Work and the online bilingual social work master's program. Dr. Lopez earned an doctorate in education from the National Louis University in Chicago, doctoral studies, Latinas in higher education. Her PhD is in Latinas in higher education. In collaboration, has designed a performance to show the findings of the research in a theatrical format. She received her master's degree in social work at the University of Illinois at Chicago and has a concentration in children and families, bachelor's in social work for the governor's state, and a women's ministry certification from Seminario Biblico in Illinois. She has over 20 years experience working with children, families, and individuals, couples, and youth in the area of counseling. Dr. Lopez is engaged in community education with women on the top in the area of women's empowerment, early childhood education, substance abuse, domestic violence, and women's ministries. Dr. Lopez co-founded Latina Childcare Providers in Action, LCCPIA, in 1998, which is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to foster economic development in the Latina community. Dr. Lopez's mission is to promote excellence, instill in individuals the desire to be excellent in everything they do, foster leadership, and to empower and motivate people to take action. She believes integrity is an essential ingredient to live a successful life. Dr. Lopez is passionate about teaching, engaging in shared knowledge with their students in the classroom, And she utilizes her bilingual skills in Spanish and English to increase and prepare more social work students to become future professionals and leaders in the underrepresented communities. Together, they will be presenting on their topic entitled Spirituality, Diversity, and Culturally Responsive Social Work Practice. Welcome both. I'm going to turn it over to you both without any further ado.
Thank you, Cassandra. All right, let me get this PowerPoint up. This is always the fun part. All right, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, I believe so. Yep.
Thank you so much. Okay, so thank you so very much for being here to attend our talk titled Spirituality, Diversity, and Cultural Responsive Social Work Practice. So Dr. Lopez and I will take turns introducing ourselves. Again, my name is Dr. Diana Franco. I am a clinical assistant professor at Loyola University Chicago School of Social Work. I have been a clinical social worker for 22 years. I live in the very beautiful Santa Fe, New Mexico, Tiwa land, but I'm originally from New York City. And my roots, my culture, my heritage are from Colombia, South America. So in terms of my own spiritual practice, I draw from South American indigenous traditions, where I have worked with maestros, maestras, teachers, and also from Mesoamerican traditions. But in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on Mesoamerican traditions, specifically the Mexica tradition, where I've also for like about 20 years have worked with teachers from the Mexica tradition. So that's where I'll be presenting on today. Dr. Lopez?
Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here today and have also the opportunity to introduce myself. My name is Maribel Lopez, AKA Dr. Lopez. I promise you there's a story behind that. Clinical assistant professor at Loyola University Chicago in the online bilingual MSW program more focusedly. Born in the beautiful island of Puerto Rico, immigrated to the States when I was about 11 and a half years old, currently reside in Chicago, Illinois. And much of my work, yes, has been done in community work, nonprofit, and working with the Latinx community. I am a wife, a mom, a proud grandmother, a social worker by birth and trade, ordained minister, and an international speaker. And I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. All right, so we're going to talk about like this happy marriage, hopefully, of spirituality and diversity and social work practice. So how does it all come together? And I want you to think about how diversity, equity, and inclusion is talked about or implemented even in universities, agencies, wherever you work or wherever you practice. So what does that mean? What is diversity and equity and inclusion, right? It really speaks to working across difference in a way that everyone is invited, everyone is part of exploring the problems and coming to solutions together. But is that really what happens? Are we always being inclusive? Are we really inclusive of all walks of life, of all cultural and spiritual practices? Are we really inviting everyone in? Are we really holding space? So I want you to think about that, what it means to you, and very specifically what we're here to do, right? What does it mean in terms of spirituality and social work practice? So I want you to pause and think about, what does spirituality mean to you? So write down some stuff in the chat, and we'll definitely take a peek at it later. We're not looking at our slides. What does spirituality mean to you? One or two words. Then I want you to think about the populations that you serve. If you are a direct practitioner, if you are a professor, if you're a supervisor, what does spirituality mean to you? Then what does it mean to your clients or to your service users? Is there a gap in terms of maybe opposing values and beliefs? And what do you do when you come across these challenges? Where you are there with, either offering services or supervising or teaching folks who may hold a different spiritual system than you do. We are going to present this to you through a framework that spirituality may be a source of healing, a source of strength, empowerment, hope, and also resilience. We tend to focus a lot on the deficits and on problems, but we want to also bring in spirituality as a way in which we can look at solutions to problems. And we want you to engage in critical self-reflection. Who am I? What do I bring to this space when we talk about spirituality? Do I hold a bias against certain spiritual religion? And Dr. Lopez?
And so we see it as spirituality, inclusion also meaning spirituality. So in other words, that we cannot separate the self, that physical self, from the spiritual self. This is an approach to healing for many who experience spiritual, who exercise spiritual beliefs and have a spiritual sense of being. It's an approach to healing the physical body, mind, emotion, and intergenerational trauma. So we can appreciate there has been hundreds of studies pertaining to health or mental health, showing that a strong sense of life meaning, purpose, hope. I saw somebody wrote that in the chat. Optimism and connection with the sacred, as well as participation in religious communities and the use of spiritual bias. Healing activities such as prayer, meditation, tends to be associated with higher levels of this self-reported well-being, lower levels of depression and anxiety, lower frequency of suicide, substance abuse, family violence, and an overall better mental health. Spirituality has traditionally been viewed as separate from the person. It is misunderstood and often excluded from social work. We have seen it more recently, more implemented, but throughout the history, we've seen it, this whole debate and tug of war with this spirituality and social work. Spirituality and culture overlap. So for some cultures, as mentioned, spirituality is directly associated with the tradition and customs. And think about in your work with your clients, right? Their identity is strongly associated to their spiritual self. Therefore, as practitioners, how do we hold a space, right, for spiritual practice, or for an individual that identifies as highly spiritual? Hopefully by the end of this presentation, my colleague and I can give you a glimpse of at least how to hold that space for clients who practice either, a spiritual or considers themselves highly spiritual, or practices different practices. The key here, it is not that you yourself need to practice this, but rather be open to provide that space and hold it for others.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. We also want to pause and acknowledge religion and spirituality. And there's a lot of literature that speaks to these separately, right? Religion under one definition and perhaps spirituality under another. But let's just also acknowledge that for many people across cultures, many folks may not make this distinction. Okay, so let's really make space for the very different worldviews of our clients or service users. Let's look at the literature briefly so that we have, I know we're on a little bit of a time constraint. We want to acknowledge that healing is not linear, right? It's not necessarily the way we address it through many Western systems. So it's not formulaic, it's not linear, it's complex. It happens at the individual level and also as a collective, right? Through spirituality, we can heal intergenerational wounds, and also, but there's a lot of cultures and spiritual systems that believe that even our descendants can be healed from intergenerational trauma and through spirituality. So therefore, we look at spirituality as medicine, right? In addition to Western medicine, which we're not saying that we're against, just that to be inclusive of spirituality can also be viewed as medicine through rituals, prayers, ceremonies, movements, songs, and so on, because we believe that the seeker is trying to regain balance and wholeness through the use of spirituality as part of their treatment. So for example, working with immigrants and refugees, spirituality can help them cope and even decrease symptoms of depression, anxiety, PTSD, because they may have been exposed to trauma before migration, during migration, and after resettlement. In African diasporic spirituality, we see that it can serve as a source of strength and power and healing, especially in the fight against systemic racism and sexism. And there have been studies that have focused on people who have been exposed to trauma and then have experienced ruminations about these events or the trauma. So for example, why did this have to happen to me? Why me? What if? And that these individuals found solace in focusing on God as a religious coping and mindfulness. We also see that cultural spirituality can be a protective factor, especially among Native Americans, to mitigate mental health concerns. A concern that Dr. Maribel Lopez and I share is that social work is not including, right? We're talking about inclusivity, spirituality as much in social work education. It has been attempted, but we feel it's still very inconsistent. So we really encourage you to embrace your clients and service users' worldview and their spirituality and their culture. So I'm going to speak about my own spirituality through the Indigenous Mexica curanderismo approach. So Mexica curanderismo seeks to restore balance to the body, because the approach to illness is that something was fragmented. If you experience, let's say, a traumatic event, or if something was very upsetting to you, or if you had a loss, there is a part of you that may be fragmented. So we want to bring balance back to every part of the body, the mind, the physical body, and the spirit. Mexica curanderismo comes from the Aztec tradition, but we see it now, the way it is practiced now is a blend of worldviews. So we see Aztec tradition, Catholicism through the use of folk saints. It's Mesoamerican because we also see this this tradition in Central America as well. There are also traditions that have blended with the US Southwest traditions, traditions from Europe and also from Northern Africa. Curanderismo does not follow strict guidelines, so there are no straight rules as to how the practitioner can implement this tradition. It's a way of life. It's a way of interacting with the environment and the natural world. Curanderismo's main word there in Spanish is curar, which means to heal. How do we heal? Well, through the use of plants and herbs. There are curanderos or curanderas, which is the practitioners of curanderismo, that are gifted or trained in bone setting, birth doulas, death doulas, such as myself, I am a death doula. Body work and massage, right? Because in the same way as Western social work, we want to maybe change a belief or a way of looking at something that isn't working. We also believe that the body stores energies in certain ways, and it's important to move them in order to bring the body back to wellness. And through pláticas, which is the Western definition of talk therapy, but it's more of a heart-to-heart.
Excuse me, we lost your voice. I'm not sure if I'm the only one.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, now.
Yeah,
Yes,
we
thank
can.
you. Yeah.
Okay, all
Now
right.
we can.
Okay, all right, thank you. I'll just keep going. The Mexica path honors the movements and is conscious of the movements of the earth. So we're following the cycles of the earth because we believe that each direction and each season has something to teach us. So we orient ourselves to the natural world in order to understand health and illness, and in order to also find solutions to illness. So for example, trauma, or in Spanish, susto, through curanderismo, can be seen as leaving one's own body after experiencing a traumatic event. The person can experience a range of symptoms, but through working with a curandero or curandera, through pláticas, which is those heart-to-heart talks or massage, songs, prayers, and being empowered, right? That the answer is within them, that restoring themselves back to health is within them, and it's in their hands. They can work together as a team to decrease and hopefully heal these symptoms. Dr. Lopez?
And I'll speak of my own as a Christian. I consider myself a Christian Latina woman in social work, right? So both I value, and there is value both in the social work field and Christianity, which both historically focuses on helping others and the service of others, empowering others, and also that focus on the whole person, body, mind, soul, and spirit. And as social work practitioners, we focus also on the whole person, as we should, right? This is why we practice, and we hope to be practicing a biopsychosocial, spiritual, holistic approach we should be implementing in our practice, right? Some responsive practice techniques may involve, for example, working with a client who may be going through depression, as the role of the practitioner, helping them connect with the principles of their Christianity, their faith, right? Connecting to prayer, worship, dance, song have been proven in studies to be highly effective, a major source, being connected to the spiritual self, a major source of resilience and strength. And therefore, with our clients, when we work with our clients, we should explore specific scriptures if they consider themselves Christian and connected to their spiritual self in that sense, and connecting, for example, spirituality with their religion, as it is for some, and as we mentioned before. So for example, if you're working with a client who has depression, as a clinical social worker, definitely allowing them either to pray, connecting them to some scriptures, or allowing them to connect with some scriptures that bring them hope. There are some examples in the Bible about men and women of God who, for example, went through depression. Jesus himself went through depression, and God helped them through it. And so for someone who is a Christian, they need to be understood, accepted, in that their spirituality is part also of their healing process. So continuing with, what is our role, right? Some recommendations that my colleague and I have. For the sake of time, we're kind of like rushing around here, so we can have a question Q&A time. What is our role, right? So as practitioners, right, social work practitioners, we want to practice cultural humility, right? I remember in undergrad reading about cultural competency, and I'm like, what does that mean? How can somebody be completely culturally competent unless you're from that culture? So I love when Tervalan and Murray Garcia came up with this theory being cultural humility, which is engaging in a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and critical reflection. And I also have to enter that auto-regulation, learning to auto-regulate ourselves when perhaps we do not our own biases, like my colleagues say, want to come in the way, right? Understanding and accepting and practicing clients' right to self-determination. We work from a strengths perspective, right? It's collaboration versus, I like to call, resistance, and checking yourself at the door. And you know, we say this lightly, but it is not lightly. This is very serious. Why? Because we cannot come from a framework that who we are and our preconceived notions and our belief system and our culture and our traditions do not or are not going to affect. This is why it is important that as professionals, we do check in always at the door, right? And I want to leave these last two to my colleague.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Lopez. And how do we provide space and hold space? So if we're really going to be inclusive of someone else's spirituality or service user spirituality, how do we do that? How do we do that? Like, what steps are we going to take to provide space, to create opportunities in treatment, to explore spirituality? And that means, what are some of your practices, rituals, ceremonies, prayers, songs, and the list is endless. And then how do we hold space? How am I actively listening, right? Checking my own feelings about what might be coming up, because it might be very different to my own belief system. How do I hold safe space for my service users and spiritual systems? So in the spirit of being inclusive, make spirituality part of your assessment. Ask clients or service users how they perceive, understand, or define the presenting problem and the relationship of this problem to the unknown, to the unexplained, or to their perception of God. Okay, so we're going to pause here and I guess open it up for questions at this time.
Thank you both Doctors Lopez and Franco. Most interesting. Yes, the floor is open. We have a few minutes for questions. You can either put them in the chat, which I have monitoring, or you can speak up, because I may not see if you use the hand function.
I don't know how to use the hand function. This is Robert Villa.
Welcome.
Okay. I am an elder. I have been around for 75 years. Okay, and I've been studying spirituality most of my life. The one thing I found, and what I like about this talk, is you can't define spirituality. You know, I use a paradigm that I developed for my social work program here in South at Texas A&M Kingsville here on the border. It's called rurality, and it looks at resiliencies and cultural values. Okay, and the intent is to look at that spiritual dimension. But again, like you say, you got to provide space, which means mentally and physically. I mean, to me, if you come and ask me, well, what's your spirituality? I'll tell you it's none of your business. And then the other part is I couldn't define it. Mm-hmm. Because I'm a part Native American in Mexico, so Chicano, okay? Mm-hmm. It's a way of life, right? Mm-hmm. You don't find it in the teepee, you don't find it in the church. It's how you walk every day of your life, and that is spirituality. And that's what it means to be a humble being. Mm-hmm. Because you're humble because you know you're a one being amongst the great out the environment that's out there. The great mystery that I call it my Native American. But I'm glad I joined this little presentation right now. But what attracted me was who the presenters were, right? Because I feel I have a lot in common with you, because I know where you're coming from and you know where I'm coming from. Okay. And I spent, like I said, most of my life looking into it. I've been to the colonias in Juarez. I've been to all the colonias here. I've been to sobadoras, to spiritualists, to searching for that answer. That, you know, what is it? Right. And they finally done it. It's about you. What is your relationship with yourself? That spirituality, yes. Right?
Yes.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank
you for sharing. I love what he said, right? And that you can't define it. For me personally, I had that tug of war as a Christian and a social worker. And then I would be like, I felt displaced while going through social work education. I'm like, where's spirituality in all of this? This is who I am. And then I associate it also with my religion, also myself and my religion. It's one to me. And so for me, it was very important to continue to explore it. And also, you know what, that it's so important to provide that space for others who associate themselves with their spirituality, whether it is a practice, you know, organized religion or not, because I felt displaced. And as I mentioned, I'm an ordained minister, so I get to speak a lot with members of our ministry, and that's what they feel. They feel like sometimes they're feeling displaced when they see a therapist, a clinical social worker, therapist, that they're not really accepting of who they are with their, you know, their whole self. So thank you for saying that, Robert. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Robert Villa. I just
You're
want
welcome.
I want to thank you, your thoughts and your experiences also as an elder. So thank you very much.
You know what, the other thing, you know, I'm a Vietnam veteran, right? PTSD and all the stuff. And I go through therapy and I do this and this, and what I found more helping me is my mantra that I do every morning with my sage and my feather. And I greet the morning sun. And that to me is what religion is, right? Rituals. I don't belong to an organized religion, but I belong to the religion of life. And so that I think what spirituality challenges you to think out of the box, to get out of your box, you know, because that's what you're trying to do, is form a relationship with a spiritual being, something bigger than yourself. And until you can realize that, you're stuck. And like I said, I've been at this forever, and I'm barely scratching the surface. So I am committed to trying to do this, because it's hard to present it. And then once I start talking about it, then I go, oh, shit, that's not, excuse my French, but that's not what it is. You know, it's this. And the more I investigate and the more I listen to people's stories, the more I realize I know very little, but I am willing to learn. That's it.
Thank you. I feel like this conversation that Robert's initiated alongside Doctors Franco and Lopez could just go on for a very long time, a very moving and profound. And I think what I'm taking from, what I'm hearing, what I'm taking away from it is just this dynamic, this very special dynamic of that spirituality is kind of, it's hard to define, and yet so profoundly deep and important to our identities, to our cultural existences, and so on. So that's an interesting tension. Without further delay, unless there's any more questions for our first speakers, we'll move on to our next
question. I don't have a question,
go ahead,
but I
Heather.
just wanted to quickly say, I just love the idea of death doulas. I just heard about death doulas, and I would love to connect with you further about that outside of this.
Yes, there was Dr. Franco just slipped that in, and that is a whole other topic, which we'd love to invite you one day if you're willing and able to share. Yes. Okay, well, very good. Thank you again. Wonderful. So our next two speakers who are here with us today are, you just heard from Dr. Heather Boynton, who is the vice president of the Canadian Society for Spirituality and Social Work. So we work closely, and Heather has worked in mental health for 30 years plus as a child and family therapist, a mental health consultant, a manager in adult services. And her research and teaching interests include spirituality, trauma, grief and loss, post-traumatic growth, child and family mental health, integrative and holistic practices, and interprofessional collaboration in education. She is an assistant professor at the University of Calgary, faculty at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, and a member of the Alberta Children's Hospital Research Institute. Dr. Heather Boynton will be presenting with Emma Vynck, who is an MSW thesis student presently and a research assistant at the University of Calgary, Emma is pursuing research on the lived experiences of spiritual distress for women of evangelical Christian backgrounds. She hopes to add to the conversation on spirituality and social work in allied professions. Her work experience is in mental health, and she hopes to continue applying spiritually informed learning to her professional endeavors. So welcome both, and I'll turn it over to you to talk about your topic, which you've titled Spiritual and Cultural Attunement in Social Work Practice. Welcome.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you. I'm gonna get this PowerPoint rolling.
So that was such a wonderful talk and a wonderful segue into our presentation. And we are going to look at some of the cultural and spiritual ways that we can attune and practice, bringing spirituality and culture into the space. And so we'll be building on Dr. Franco and Dr. Lopez's wonderful presentation and discuss how do we invite in and hold space for culture and spirituality.
So
Oh, go ahead, Emma.
sure, yeah. I'll jump in. As we're talking about cultural and spiritual humility, we wanted to consciously reflect on the lands that we're presenting from today. And as Heather noted at the beginning of our gathering, that connection to land can just be a huge site of cultural and spiritual significance. And many Indigenous worldviews continue to emphasize this. And we want to name the territories we're learning from today and confront colonial oppression, which has included systemic and ongoing oppression of many Indigenous cultural and spiritual practices. I'll pass it over to you, Heather.
Right. So just again, we want to make sure that we're honoring the lands as well as the people and all our relatives and elements and trees and everything from the land that bring us the wisdom that we have for this presentation today.
Definitely. Yeah, I'm coming from the Tsimshian territory, which is on the northwest coast of British Columbia, Canada.
So we thought we'd share just quickly our positionality and coming together to present, because it's important when we're thinking about cultural and spiritual humility and competence, and we're going to talk more about that word competence. So myself, I'm from a mixed European background. My grandparents actually were born in Canada and the United States. I also spent time down in Illinois, in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, close to where Dr. Franco and Dr. Lopez are, for 2 years. I'd made my first real connection to this mind, body, spirit connection in my physical and health education degree, although I've had spiritual experiences since I was a young child, and not having safe spaces to really be able to express fully my spirituality. Then in my work with children, I really noticed this spiritual aspect was so pivotal to trauma, grief, and loss, both as a strength and a struggle. So cultural competence and spiritual competence are important in my research and my work, and spirituality has really become a passion area.
And I'm Emma. Heather's my lovely thesis supervisor, and she's invited me to join you today. I'm a settler person of Dutch heritage, and coming to this conversation with a passion for spirituality and normalizing conversations about spirituality and religion. And I grew up immersed in evangelical Christianity, and I'm really grateful for the beauty and the joys of that. But I also did experience some spiritual distress in that setting. And so I've had some processes of disconnecting and disconstructing and reconstructing and building and nourishing spirituality. And so that's sort of what I'm looking at in my thesis, trying to look at how women of evangelical Christian backgrounds experience spiritual distress. And I hope that in our social work practice, we can have a really nuanced appreciation for how spirituality shows up for people.
So for our presentation today, we're going to actually just present quickly a couple of current events or somewhat current events in North American things that are going on that really speak to the need for us to pay attention to culture and spirituality. We'll just very briefly again go through the concepts and also why we feel religion and spirituality are so critical for our work that we do with everyone. And we'll also talk about the different components of cultural competence or competency. And we're going to really give you a couple of tools for integrating that into practice as well as an organizational tool.
Wonderful. So yeah, just to maybe ground things, I know everyone was exploring how sometimes defining these terms can be tricky, and I think some grounding concepts or events show that spirituality and culture are constantly present, and we can see them in our news feeds. And this image shows an image of many visitors from various Indigenous nations and groups from Canada visiting the Pope in the Vatican. And recently, the Pope did provide an apology to Indigenous peoples for the harms that the Catholic Church perpetrated through the residential school system. And those words were very long overdue, and they did not fully fulfill the call to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, which really required this apology to be made on the soil of Canada over here. So that quote really speaks to now the hard work starts, and that's from Phil Fontaine, who's a former chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Now the hard work starts, and this is like a way bigger topic, but I'm sure it could resonate with some folks in the room. And as a settler person who spent a lot of time in white-dominated Christian spaces, I definitely see myself implicated in that hard work of acknowledging how colonization and spirituality and culture are complicated and painful topics for many folks. And I'm sure many of you in your social work practice have worked with folks who, for this area, can be quite tender, and we want to be aware of that as well. A whole other challenging area to unpack. So I'll just briefly mention the American context certainly has no shortage of events in the public eye, highlighting the profound role religion and spirituality can play in our lives and in public life. The Capitol insurrection on January 6th, 2021 brought up a lot of concerns about the influence of white Christian nationalism, which seems to be a growing force. And we have seen increasing political battles about vaccine mandates, about critical race theory in school. So it's an ongoing conversation. And so religion and spirituality are not niche topics, as I'm sure the people in the room agree. They're totally interwoven into ethical challenges that we face in our personal and professional lives. So with those kind of grounding concepts or events, we'll dive into some ideas. So culture, it's a huge term and involves many different aspects. So Garth White defines culture as the customs, beliefs, ideology, worldview, and values common to a group of people, which guide their individual and social behavior. And there could be cultures that are a full nation, there could be smaller subcultures, and we're all part of many various cultures in that sense. And a culture would include our common heritage and history that's passed from one generation to the next, with shared customs, traditions, arts, folklore, lifestyle, and often shared ideas on roles and relationships. We do want to note that sometimes culture can be interchanged with race and ethnicity, and these terms are actually not necessarily interchangeable. Race, rather, is a social construct that's describing people with shared physical characteristics. And we know this can have a tremendous social significance on the opportunities that folks can receive. And it should not necessarily be conflated with one's culture. Ethnicity, according to Yang, rather refers to social identity and mutual sense of belonging that defines a group of people through common historical or family origins and beliefs. So as Heather and I were prepping for this presentation, we were looking at this image and we saw that a lot of those colorful bubbles could fit into spirituality as well. Spirituality has attitudes, beliefs. It has often customs and rituals, as we were sharing, but we see that faith and religion has its own bubble here. So we would agree with the with our our previous presenters that there's this overlap with spirituality and culture. But maybe we'll jump in to some helpful definitions there. And so we all have our own lived experience and understanding of these terms, and the overlap may look very different for each of us. For our purposes today, we can maybe provide a few definitions. So religion could be defined as institutionalized patterns of values, beliefs, and behaviors shared by a group focused on spiritual matters and repeated over generations. Whereas we could define spirituality as an essential, universal human capacity involving a search for meaning and purpose. And it may be linked with religion or it may be not, depending on who we are. So we do see an overlap there in a search for the sacred. And while not all of our spiritual experiences are associated with religion, many of our religious experiences may be linked with spirituality. So now that we have jumped on a few of these terms, maybe we can ask ourselves, why consider religion and spirituality in practice? So maybe for the sake of time, I know, Heather, we were going to do a chatterfall. Folks can feel free to throw out any of the ideas that they have. Why consider religion and spirituality in practice? And I'm sure many of us in the room are like, oh, so many reasons. That's why we're here in this call. And so some of the things the literature shows, as previously noted, that religion and spirituality can really facilitate post-traumatic growth. We have a significant body of literature affirming this, that many folks want it included in their treatment. We see lower levels of mental health struggle in populations with a higher religious or spiritual engagement. And there's connections with more hope and self-esteem and greater meaning in life for many folks. There's links with the positive well-being, which can link to positive physical well-being if we have more religious and spiritual engagement. And yeah, as noted, for folks living with trauma, religion and spirituality can just have a huge role in facilitating healing. So it is worth noting that although we have a lot of literature supporting the well-being related to faith and to spirituality, we do have literature also showing that it can be a challenging area as well. And since Heather and I both explore spiritual struggle a bit in our research, we did want to touch on that as well. But what is spiritual struggle or distress? We could call it tension, strain, and conflict about sacred matters with the supernatural, with other people, and within oneself. And I'm sure we can all think of clients that we've worked with who maybe have a tender point around faith or spirituality. This might be something we resonate with in our personal lives. And there is a body of literature that does look at some of these negative health impacts of spiritual struggle. There's some empirical work from psychology that looks at links between struggling spiritually and negative health outcomes around depression, anxiety, suicidality, self-esteem struggle, cognitive dissonance, and certainly isolation if folks don't feel safe to share that with their faith community. And some folks may not feel safe presenting this with a practitioner. Some findings show that folks are worried this will be downplayed or misunderstood. So it's important for us to have a nuanced appreciation that there can be a dark side of spirituality for some folks. And these areas we have listed on the slide are spots that could catalyze existential and spiritual struggle. We've got illnesses, accidents, major life transitions that could lead someone to really struggling spiritually and pondering. experiencing social justice, inequity, and oppression, going through trauma, a shattering of worldview, and grief and loss, a death doula would be coming in these spaces for sure to support someone through that struggle. So now that we've taken a moment to explore religion, spirituality, and well-being, we're going to come back to this grounding concept of cultural competence. So when we think about developing cultural competence, Heather and I really see that as a lifelong pursuit. And there is certainly a debate about that term, and a very fair debate. And we, in the call, we may have different perspectives on it. And the debate certainly addresses how this term competent implies that we could have a check mark box and understand someone's culture. And that's not the perspective Heather and I endorse at all. Instead, we're really informed by a social work scholar, Danzo, who wrote a critical reflection on the use of the term cultural competence and humility. And Danzo presented that using an anti-oppressive lens, the literature and findings from cultural competence scholarship can really include a humility. And it's about an ongoing learning process, not a technical certificate of achievement. And so we appreciate that there are varying opinions on this, and we want to be open to learning there too. Knowing that our licensing boards and colleges use the words competence at times to describe our capacities that we're developing, we can appreciate that cultural competence can include the development, the ongoing capacity to increase our humility, developing safety in spaces with clients, attuning with folks, being appropriate in the interventions we use, and is ultimately being responsive and sensitive. So in these next slides, Heather's going to discuss this more in detail. Maybe I'll hand over to you, Heather, now to touch on these definitions.
Yeah, so in the top definition, we can see cultural competence has been around for a while and really has been, thinking about looking at cultural diversity and being sensitive and respectful. And this continues to evolve as Dr. Franco and Dr. Lopez also mentioned about the cultural humility aspect. And, I wrote this sort of spiritual competence definition in 2016, and I'm looking at it even today thinking, as I've learned over the last number of years, that this is just a beginning point, right? That was just a beginning point for me. This is so much more in depth now. If I were to write what is spiritual competence now, it would be so much more expansive. And so we see all these terms, in the language. And so we want to sort of bring some of this together. And so we'll sort of talk about some of these aspects in the next few slides. So let's just some of the elements that we are going to talk about is an awareness, safety, humility, attunement, appropriateness, and then competency. And how are we continually evolving our competency as part of our ethical practice? So in terms of awareness, we definitely need to think about things. We have to adopt critical consciousness, where ourselves as professionals and in the work we do within organizations, that we engage in this ongoing self-reflection and self-awareness, and that we hold ourselves accountable for providing culturally and spiritually safe care. This involves reflective and reflexive practices. We each come with our own spiritual worldview and how we make sense of life and the universe and existence. And our worldview shapes our actions and our behaviors. So our worldview comes from our culture, from our spirituality, from context. And so that shapes who we are and how we live. It's, as Robert was saying, it's a way of being. And so responsive practice really involves exploring these parts of ourselves and those of our clients. So engaging in our own awareness of our own spirituality and cultural aspects really requires us to question our own biases, our attitudes, our assumptions, our stereotypes and prejudices, even our values and how our own worldview has come to be. When we can really deeply understand ourselves and how we present in the world and where these judgments and prejudices might come up, we're able to be more transparent with clients, and we're able to have and enter into those difficult conversations when we have done that piece of the work. We also really need to think about our own ethnocentricity. We all come from a place and have beliefs where they're either explicit or implicit that might have an inherent superiority in our lens of our own ethnic group or culture or spirituality or religion. So we have to think about how that might come forward. So holding an open awareness for learning involves being aware of difference, considering power relationships, working towards decolonization. And it's important for us as professionals to really have an ongoing practice of this sort of reflective engagement and the interpersonal interactions that we have with others. And how do we think about transference of power within multiple contexts and within service delivery? The next aspect that we want to really include is safety. And I mentioned I have myself experienced places of unsafeness in terms of expression of spirituality. So when we are thinking about how do we meet culture and spirituality within the work that we do, it relates also to physical safety. It also relates to emotional safety. When judgments and misunderstandings and disrespect are experienced in relational processes, that's when others don't feel safe. And that's when we think about attrition and dropout rates. And we look at some of the research. Some of that is that people don't feel safe, or they don't feel understood, or they don't feel respected. So we need to open the door. We need to open and have a model for the capacity for relational repair. And we can do this in our first meeting with our clients. So for example, if I say or do anything that bothers you or offends you or that you don't like, please tell me so we can talk about it, or that I can stop doing that. I don't want to do things that are bothering you or upsetting you or not helpful. And I hope that you will do the same. If I, notice something, that I will be open with you and honest, and that we can repair our relationship. And by doing this, we open the door for our clients and those we work with to experience relational repair. For many people, they have not experienced this type of deep connection and ability to have a relational repair. So through intentional listening and attending and responding to cultural, spiritual content and reflecting that for individuals that we're working with, we are creating this safe, sacred therapeutic space for dialogue, for expression and intervention that we co-create with the one we're working with. Spiritual listening also includes the ability to really be responsive to and attend to some of the spiritual meanings, some of the symbols, or even subordinate storylines that are going on in the dialogue, in the narrative of the individual that we're working with. And so really listening to the meanings attached to motivations and desires and essential drives, what is meaningful for them. And sometimes this also opens us to enter a space of vulnerability where we are being curious and learning and sharing and affirming and creating trust and shared meaning with another. So creating relational safety really allows the other, our clients or patients, to really feel that their culture, spirituality, and their identity and ways of being are held in safety. And Hansen talks about once we share relational space in this way, we become co-keepers of this cherished space. I just want to touch briefly on physical safety too, because we want you to consider even things like the front of the building, the entryway, the waiting area, the rooms in the building, the walls, the colors, the artwork, and how do these welcome different cultures, religions, or spiritualities? Do you have objects in your office that let clients know it's a safe space culturally and spiritually? Have you looked at pamphlets and websites and things like that? So really being conscious of the physical and the emotional space we have for clients. The next slide talks about cultural humility. And I'm not going to go into this in great depth, but there's a wonderful video, if you haven't seen, on YouTube by Turvalon and Murray Garcia. And it's about a half-hour video on cultural humility. It's excellent. I use it in my classes. It's wonderful. Really, so being involved with addressing cultural humility is really about that lifelong learning and reflection that I talked about. And then also, it also involves what's called the 3 Ps of culture and spirituality, which are power, privilege, and prejudices. And we also need to recognize historical realities and the violence and oppression and injustices. We have included a 4th P of partnership with people and advocacy. And we feel that we need to have this stance within the work that we do. Moving on to the next slide. Now, this is, Emma and I had a lot of conversations over the last while about cultural competence. And in talking about spirituality, we really came up with this word attunement, where attunement is being in the presence, being in the energy, and really attuning and paying deep, deep attention, being that humble knower, being that humble person, practicing that humility. Hoskins identified 5 key areas of cultural attunement, which I think apply also to spiritual attunement. So again, acknowledging the pain and oppression. And as part of a dominant, being in a dominant culture, we have to remember pains that have been inflicted and that still live in our shadow sides of our behavior today. We often tend to repeat some of these discriminatory acts, not in bright open spaces, but because it's not politically correct to do so, but we sometimes in shady places still engage in some of these oppressive conversations or acts, and sometimes really unknowingly are doing that. They also talk about engaging in acts of humility, and they talk about acting with reverence. Hoskins states that respect for difference is often listed as a really essential quality when we're working with cultural diversity. But the word respect can be somewhat problematic at times, right? Because it implies judgments or approval rather than sort of this total acceptance. But on the other hand, reverence for another person has implications in terms of being in relation with others, and esteem and honor and regard and worship and awe are sort of synonymous with the word for reverence. And that's how we sort of want to be coming into space, into that relational space. So if we revere someone, we enter the relationship with awe and a feeling of honor for the other person. Engaging in mutuality is really a feeling of closeness, and that speaks to our alliance, right? Our ability to try to align with one another, a feeling of connection when 2 human beings come together and develop a relationship, and the therapeutic aspects that Carl Rogers speaks to. And maintaining a position of not knowing. So this is kind of like holding a dialectical stance, right, of awareness. So we know about some things about culture and spirituality, but we also have a deep awareness of what we don't know. And so holding that dialectic is important. We have added heart to heart or soul to soul and unconditional love to this framework. We don't often talk about love in social work, and yet what often brings us to social work is a love for humanity and a love for one another and our common humanity. So attunement involves sort of a deep attention, unconditional regard, and a resonance with another. It's being fully and authentically present and perceiving and understanding the expression of the other person's experience and opening our heart for that heart-to-heart or soul-to-soul connection. And so sensing that energy, mirroring a response, and really attending to what's going on for ourselves in terms of our own emotions and what is presented in the room, and really sort of creating a greater intimacy with our clients. So, we often hear in other cultures about unconditional love and loving kindness, or Martin Buber talks about the I-thou relationship. And this type of relationship is the highest form of human expression and connection. And so I think that's what we need to think about in terms of attunement and striving for coming together. On the bottom, you'll see an arrow, and there was a book called A Practice Beyond Cultural Humility. Grauf and Grons and colleagues, they developed this model called the ORCA model. And this is a relational stance. So the openness, the respect, curiosity, and accountability. I added the reverence piece to respect in this slide. That's not part of their model, but I think that moves that deeper if we do that. And so that's a really good book. And this model actually can be used also in supervision or in our work with one another as colleagues. So I think this is a good model that you can move to. Appropriateness is really about thinking about how are the interventions that we use appropriate for the client that we're working with. We need to consider how the problem or presenting issues are defined by the client. And in terms of assessment, we need to really think about the cultural and spiritual relevant information to consider what's the best approach for the interventions. Oftentimes we just choose things and we don't realize the ontology and epistemology behind those. And so we need to make sure they're going to be a good fit. We need to question whether the procedures and practices we employ are culturally and spiritually sensitive. So we also want to think about the value base of the intervention as well, and really think about informed consent on a deeper level. When we're offering the interventions, we need to be clear about, the philosophy behind them. We have to think about where they've come from, and is that a really good fit? Even things like mindfulness and yoga and things that can be really helpful for people, we still need to think about how is it fit for that person? Is that something that they really feel that it's something they want to try to do? So we also want to think about things like language and how is language important in the interventions that we provide? What language are we using? Are the interventions even available in the language of the individual? And can we get it in their own language? So we really need to think about how we're doing things currently. We need to evaluate these pieces and really think about cultural and spiritual appropriateness. So that brings us to the next slide, which is on competency. And again, we have talked about all the different words that are important in competency. So, safety, appropriateness, attunement, humility, lifelong learning, being aware, these are all part of competencies. And so in our ethical practice framework, we need to continually develop our competency as social workers and have to consider the cultural and spiritual competencies we need in order to continue to develop our practice and really think about developing our skills and abilities all the time and always evolving. We also want to start to think about examples of, I can give you examples from my own work. So I encountered a number of children and parents when there was experiences of things like seeing ghosts or hearing and seeing spirits or angels or other spiritual beings and entities. In many cultures, this is revered. It's a strength or a skill. So in determining the difference between psychosis and spiritual experiences, we really need to consider belief systems, ways of being, and functionability. And this is a whole topic we could go on more with, but I'll keep that short. But we really need to be prepared for all the different things that come in the door. I had another client who, young child, who all of a sudden started speaking in tongues, and the parents were wanting to have an exorcism done. And so I had to quickly learn about what this meant and what was happening for this youth. So there's all kinds of things that you can encounter in terms of culture and spiritual aspects. And so also knowing when we need to refer to someone else is really important, and being within our scope of practice. So really thinking about being a culturally and spiritually sensitive therapist is being authentic and respectful, humble, transparent, caring, curious, and one who's an interested partner. So we bring our theory and our practice expertise into the safe therapeutic relationship, and then we need to become the learner and have these transparent relationships that I talked about. And if we do this, we can be agents of hope and capitalize on the positive aspects of culture and spirituality and help people through the distress they may be experiencing. And we can facilitate transcendence and growth and healing. So the next slide just really reiterates that competence does not mean you're an authority, does not mean you need to know everything. It's about having a profound respect and really being eager to be open and learning and listening and really demonstrating that genuineness, empathy, caring, concern, and reverence for another, and expanding our knowledge, skills, and attitudes. The next slide just talks about how we're going to integrate this into practice. And I'm just going to quickly review because I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. So we're going to just look quickly at how you can develop attunement and humility and competency. So the first stage, of course, is that self-assessment, reflective practice piece. And I realize, Emma, this was your part and I'm stepping on your toes.
Go for it. Yeah, go for it, Heather.
Okay.
Step right on me.
And then the other pieces around consultation, right? So in supervision or peer consultation or consultation with elders and spiritual healers and spiritual care is really important so that we're always ensuring that we're thinking about things effectively and really taking into consideration all that we need to, really continuing to develop our knowledge, having a stance of epistemological humility, and really, I think the last stage is becoming a role model and a leader, right? All of you here today have the opportunity to become spiritual influencers and cultural influencers, and to be able to take these teachings forward and really thinking about how we can maybe change things in the work that we do. So we want to, instead of accepting, this is how we've always done things, we want to move to how can we change up what we've done, or how can we have a critical lens from a cultural and spiritual stance on all the pieces of things that we do in the work that we do. And then this last slide here has a bunch of spiritual assessment tools that are in the literature. The most popular one is the second one, the Vynck model, which is looking at the faiths, beliefs, and meanings and asking yourself, do you consider yourself to be a spiritual or religious? Do you have beliefs that help you cope with stress or difficult life situations? I as importance and influence, and what role does spirituality play in your current situation, and how important is it in your life? And then C is community and connections, and that involves people that you're connected to, that you love or who are important to you, and maybe a spiritual community, a religious community, or cultural groups. And then how, in the context of treatment, would you like your spirituality to be addressed? And are there aspects that are important for your treatment? And so these are tools that we can ask these questions of ourselves before we ask them of our clients. So I would encourage you to take a look at these tools. David Hodge has an article describing strengths of several other tools that include using spiritual histories and life maps and genograms, echo maps, and echograms. And that's, his article is really helpful in terms of thinking of how you might use this for yourself in your own exploration, as well as for that with clients. He also has a good article on implicit spirituality, which can offer some questions that you can look at that really get to, it's helpful for if someone feels that they're not maybe spiritual or religious, but it gets to looking at the aspects of connection and meaning making and purpose, and it uses non-spiritual language. So I would encourage you also to look at that. Also lots of books. Kanda, Furman and Kanda's new book, Spiritual Diversity, is probably the most known. And then Dudley has another book. So just that they continue to pop up. I encourage you to take a look. In terms of spiritual interventions, Dr. Franco and Dr. Lopez mentioned a whole bunch. I have used a lot of these in the work that I do, and thinking about how can you maybe incorporate some of these into the work that with clients that might feel right for the client. This last slide is a tool that can be used for assessing competence and really looks at different levels. So it's a great chart. There's also a checklist on the bottom of this slide. We'll make these slides available. You can click on the checklist and do that slide for, or that assessment for yourself as well. So just thinking about today, wanting to think if there was a thread from today's presentation you can carry into your work, feel free to put that in the chat, and we will open up for questions or conversation.
Yeah, questions or convo.
Thank you, Heather and Aaron. Lots of information there. Thank you both. Keeping the conversation alive. The floor is open for questions, comments.
Hi, I have a question. Thank you for that fantastic presentation. I noticed that Heather, I noticed that your area of interest involves children. It seems like you have a lot of previous work. So how do you think, how does this vary based on age?
Well, that's a really good question. So the research that I did for my PhD was fascinating. So I talked to 8 to 12-year-old children. And I've had, because of the work that I did, I wanted to really explore this area. What was fascinating was when I was writing up the results of my research, my committee asked me to make sure I included who was the adult and who was the child, because at times they couldn't tell by what the words were written. Children, if you ask them, are deep philosophers. They have a lot to say and they haven't got the spaces to say it. I think especially in that 8 to 12-year-old range, they are very open and attuned to the spiritual world. Even younger children, if we watch younger children and how they express themselves in nature, how they see the beauty of a butterfly or a bubble or those things. So I think in terms of opening ourselves to the spirituality of children, we just have to make space and we just have to open those conversations. The children that I talked to had a lot to say. They felt that adults just needed to know in their heart that they know. That was a quote from a child. that they need to be able to allow children to open and explore and express at their own pace as well. But that they really wanted it to be part of the counseling, and they really wanted it to be part of their lives. Some of them were struggling with spiritual aspects and things like being angered at a higher power or angry with God. So they needed support in that relationship, in repairing that relationship.
Fascinating.
So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I could go on more, but yeah, I'd be happy to connect further if you'd like.
Great. Sounds wonderful.
Yeah, and I believe I read an article that you wrote, and I really found it fabulous. There was a chapter, I think.
Well, I was thinking there's a lot in there about relational spirituality when it comes to children. And I think one of the journals, I think you're on the board of one of the journals that had published a lot of stuff in that area. So yeah, I will definitely send you an email.
Yeah, wonderful.
Thank you, Anne. Anyone else? I just want to draw your attention to the chat. There's been some wonderful comments and also links to different resources. So have a look there, everyone. The video that Heather had mentioned on cultural humility was posted on YouTube.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. And then Dr. Harman also posted a resource, a measurement of religiosity and so on.
Great.
And spiritual, yeah. I really like, Heather and Aaron, how you were able, like the provision of resources and just the how-to, because isn't that for all of us in this field, that is a recurrent question. That the topic of spirituality and religion and social work resonates. It resonates frequently with both practitioners, students, and clients. And yet, but there are fewer resources. Although, as you rightly point out, more and more are popping up, but it's still not part of core curriculum. And so, it's sort of the question of how do we do this? How do we practice? How do we embody our spirituality in practice, because we have been taught to keep them separate, as social work became part of became secularized, and so they have been it's been divided from, and that we know that that's not how people live their lives, that the spiritual spaces and that the social spaces are often those where meaning is created.
If I can jump in there, Cassandra.
Of course you can. Yes, go right ahead.
That's a very good question, and I want to quote two people. And oh my Lord, I hope I get it right. I'm not sure it was exactly Toni Morrison, but help me out when I say it if somebody remembers this.
Float away. Quote Toni Morrison.
If it hasn't been written, that means you have to write it. And then that's the same. That is the same quote also. Ardeen at Loyola. I'll say something like, well, I can find something on this topic. And he's like, well, that means you need to write it. So you added. And so I'm in agreement with you, Cassandra, in that there's still that gap, right? Even though society and culturally is demanding it. It's demanding it. Current times is demanding it. More and more individuals, as a result of this pandemic, are looking for that source of strength and faith and hope and to keep them going. And so, yeah, I'm speaking to myself too, Dr. Franco, Dr. Harman here, and everybody here. We must write it. We must speak of our own, even our own experiences, because it matters. It matters. And so, yeah, there's a gap and we have to keep pushing forward.
Can I piggyback on that? Because that is so true. And I think this artificial bifurcation between like the spirituality and the social work is something that academia did, but the clients have never done it. and practitioners who understand the value of it have never done it. We have never, disaggregated one from the other. And, so it strikes me that academia has to catch up to society's expectations. In fact, there are studies out there where the data show that when clients come to therapy, they are hoping that they can bring that aspect of themselves with them. And I think we know that when we're able to incorporate, interventions into the clinical helping process that are, indigenous to their spiritual practices, we have a much greater sense, success rate. They come back more, they feel better when the process of treatment is over. And so the fact that we're not talking about it really strikes me as very Abraham Flexner, like this notion that in order to be validated as, truly scientific, we have to eschew any sort of connectedness to spirituality. And again, that is just not the way our clients live their lives. And so, so it is time for us to integrate this content into our stuff. And I had posted a little earlier during Dr. Franco and Dr. Lopez's piece about how CSWE is updating EPAS now, our educational standards, and they're saying like there should be a greater emphasis on this. We actually hosted like a multi-day 2-week forum on this about a summer or two ago, and really it seems like what it comes down to is we need professors who are willing to learn what they don't know, and teach that content to the students, and be very intentional about it, because it's not enough to just say it's an aspect of diversity. It's so much bigger than that. And so I think that's the thing, is how do we help our colleagues feel comfortable in their discomfort and not knowing, so that they can learn this and thus teach it to the students who are better able to go out now and practice competently with their clients.
And this is highly important, what you just mentioned. I'll shut up after this, I promise.
No.
But this is really important, because it is not about you. The cliche, right? The cliche. It is not about you. And sometimes, or most often, the complaints I receive is, well, I'm looking for, psychotherapy or therapy, but with the element of, that I'm accepted with my faith and then my spiritual self. And I don't find that. And so what often happens is that they fall through the cracks, or they don't quite, continue to go through. So again, back to, if we're in this profession, there is a responsibility. I think was Heather, you mentioned this, right? We're in here because we care. Our hearts are in it. We care about humanity. We know the connectedness. We know that what happens to one happens to all, right? And so if we mean that, then remember, it's not about us. And I'll stop now.
That's really great. And just in terms of, how do we do it? That's sort of where I'm at right now, is teaching. How do we do it? There's been enough talk about it's important. Now let's get at it, right? Like, let's
actually.
And I've been really, like, I actually started doing this in my own practice back in the 90s is when I really started to notice about spirituality. And I've really, done a deep dive and read everything I could possibly get to read. And so I did start to include spirituality into my practice. And I do have some insights in terms of how to go about doing that. And so there's just so much work to do, though, for us to be able to, talk about how do we do it and bring together all the wisdom from everybody else that's been doing it too and has ideas and concepts. So I'm sensing Kim and Cassandra and Regina, I'm sensing a special edition journal.
Hey, I love that.
And you know what? Can I just say, so echoing what you said, Heather, and thank you, Dr. Lopez, for the call to action that let's write it to pick up on Toni Morrison's words. Absolutely. And it is about doing it, but it is surprising. Just we all know it resonates how important it is, and yet it's still outside of core curriculum. And several years ago, probably now 8 years ago, in my own teaching practice in the undergraduate and the bachelor's of social work, one of our core courses called theoretical foundations, would go through a number of approaches to social work. So practice theories, more larger paradigms like a feminist lens and anti-racist lens, all of the anti-oppression and so on, right through to various practice pieces. But when I was teaching it, I inserted some modules, some classes, if you will, on spirituality and social work as a lens, as bringing that. And it seemed so novel at the time in the sense that it was new. So I guess I'm just remarking, because it often is for those of us who are teaching in colleges and faculties, that it is, you have to bring it into, you have to slip it in, right? You have to modify the curriculum, teach independent studies, which is another approach I've done, students who have approached guide independent studies, as Heather's currently doing with Erin, supervise graduate work. These are some ways that we can begin to bring it in and continue to advocate with our our larger organizations about centering more on the spirituality and social work. That's what I will say. I'm just I feel like there's so much more. I'm looking at the yes, okay. Definitely a special edition. I just want to, because I'm mindful of the time, I need to sign off shortly. Heather, on that note, would you be able, I don't know how much longer, are we supposed to wrap up at 3?
Yeah, I think we should wrap. We
Okay.
were supposed to wrap up.
I want to draw
so-
attention. Kimberly and Regina posted it in the chat, but there is the upcoming conference, a signature event of both societies, but the American Society for Spirituality and Social Work is holding their conference called How the Spirit Moves. Is it right, Kimberly?
There we go. You would think that I would know how to unmute, but we've only been on Zoom forever, right? So yes, I did put a link in the chat, but I'm happy to put another one because there's been so much robust conversation in the chat as well. But June 7th through the 10th, we're hosting our second virtual conference. And we are hoping to partner with you. We're planning on partnering with you guys for the 23 conference. So we'll go back to our every other year being in Canada or the States. This one will be virtual. It's our second one in a row for doing virtually. And we highly encourage everyone to attend. The speakers you heard today will be presenting. Others who are on the call, I've seen your name on my presenter list too. And there's just lots and lots of folks, and it's literally global. We have folks who are going to be zooming in from Spain and a few other countries. It's been a lot to manage, but it's a good lot to manage. And so we are working with, so one of the member benefits of being in the society is that you get a subscription to the Journal of Religion and Spirituality and Social Work. And so we're working with the editor-in-chief to try to put together the conference proceedings as a special issue of that journal so that this information does get out beyond the conference. And so if you are interested in that, and I did get a message, so yes, we're definitely going to have to talk, but the pre-conference Institute on June 7th, it's the first day, it has a virtual writing workshop, so we can all write together in community on whatever that project is that you just have to finish. But it'll have 2 breakout sessions, and one of them talks about the process of how we're going to put together the conference proceedings for the special issue. So we are super hopeful that all of you all join us online, and then we can't wait to see you guys north of the border in 23.
Thank you, Kimberly. So with that, I will draw this session to a close. Thank our speakers, Doctors Franco, and Lopez, and Boynton, Heather Boynton, and Emma de Vynck. Sorry, I think I called you Erin, Emma, at some point. I apologize for that. Thank you all, and for all of you for participating and for your comments and testimony. This is exciting. So thank you for attending the first of this joint series. And we hope to see you at future events. Spread the word. This will be posted on our websites for those who weren't able to come today. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Heather, I'm going to have to run.
Yeah, I'm just going to,
I'll stop recording.
yeah,
Okay.
where's the record? Stop.